Hey, Bob, welcome to Shaboom.
Thanks a lot, Rick.
Well, I'm so glad you're here today. We've been friends for a long time. I think about when I showed up knowing absolutely nothing about public relations at Conan Wolf, and Norman Airy brought me there in 1985, and you were the first guy to greet me. I think you felt you had a kindred spirit because you had worked in sport and I had worked in sport.
Oh yeah, no, basketball coach at Emory. Goodness.
So it was a lot of fun from that standpoint. But let's start with your career. Were the Braves your first job out of college?
Yeah, it's really interesting how you just by showing up, you have interesting things happen. But when I was a freshman in college, I needed a part-time job to work my way through school. So I just showed up on a Saturday morning. I made a list of places that seemed like places I'd like to work while I was in college. And number one on my list was the Braves. And I just showed up on a Saturday morning and they hired me. So I worked my way through college there. And I was thinking this morning with all the World Cup stuff happening in Atlanta that as a part-time worker for the Braves when I was in college, I was the public relations director of the original Atlanta Chiefs, which were owned by the Braves.
Yeah.
We won the North American Soccer League, but excuse me, the YMCA told me recently that youth soccer started in Atlanta. And I remember when we had our soccer team, the Chiefs, that unlike the other teams in the league, we didn't have any soccer being played in Atlanta at all. In fact, half of the people in Atlanta thought SOCCER spelled saucer. And so it just was logical to start youth leagues. And so the YMCA, in fact, originally the Decatur YMCA, started youth league soccer, which then spread across the country.
I remember that era that Pele and Santos came to Atlanta to play the Chiefs. Remember?
Yeah. We didn't have Google, so nobody could, check to see if whatever we said was totally accurate. So we promoted the first tour of Pele through the U.S. And I just found whatever information I could. Then I sort of embellished it that he was a national treasure in Brazil and all, gave him all, he talked about the moats being around the soccer fields in Brazil. I'd never been to Brazil, but it just built this bigger than life. So he was bigger than life anyway, but built this image of him that was quite remarkable. And in a place like Atlanta where they'd never heard of Pele one month, the next month they rushed the field after the game, ripped his shirt off. So
yeah, it's cool. Crazy. Years later, I worked for MasterCard and we signed Pele to be our spokesperson before the 94 World Cup in the U.S. And I had a chance to be with him. I actually had a woman that worked for me named Marissa D'Amico, and she was his handler.
Oh, yeah.
She took him everywhere. And, we had Pele cutouts and we had all this. He was, to me, like Arnold Palmer. He was the guy that either he loved people or he convinced you he loved people.
Yeah.
Because he never met a stranger. He was always on. He was always so genuine and so fun. And
there was a time when he genuinely was probably the Michael Jordan of soccer. I mean,
there's no question.
He was it worldwide. I mean, certainly soccer was huge in England and Europe and all, but boy, it was nothing like, Santos of Brazil and Pele. So.
Well, you spent time with the Braves. I know you wrote a book. I think it was called "We Could Have Finished Last Without You." Those were interesting times of the Braves, where you were really having to promote to get people to come out and support them. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, Ted Turner, when he bought the Braves, and that's when we really started promoting hard, didn't really have any money. I mean, he bought the Braves for $10 million, but it was like buying a house. He didn't have $10 million. So the Braves had $2 million in the bank. And basically the Chicago group, Bill Bartholomew and that group, didn't want the team to move to Toronto. They had made the commitment to Atlanta and they just wanted, and Ted was the only owner they could find. And so You
Isn't
know,
that crazy today with the numbers that are out there?
I mean, it's nuts. I mean, it's billions of dollars. Back then, $10 million with a little down paying each month was what the Braves cost him. So we didn't have money to have a good team, and we knew that. And he pretty much knew that they weren't going to be competitive. So we had this theme, keep the smoke going after the fire goes out. Let's just promote like crazy and at least get people to pay attention, and some of them will show up. So, we did that, but that was, I mean, for me, it was good because like you, I enjoyed the promotional part of it, and it kind of gave you the carte blanche. You didn't have to, there was nothing that was too outrageous. We could just go ahead and do whatever. And and the team, we didn't have all bad players. We certainly had Phil Necro as a Hall of Famer and all, but and if we'd had four Phil Necros, we would have had a good team because Phil Necro would win 24 games with a last place team, but we didn't have four Phil Necros.
I remember, he would always, you think about how successful he was, but in that era, he always got the visiting team's #1 pitcher too.
Yeah.
And
And
so
the other thing,
it was always those 2-1 game, it was.
and the other thing is he holds the major league record for losing the most games when his team didn't score. And by the nature of any sport, if your team doesn't score, you don't have a real great chance
Exactly.
of winning.
Yeah. Yeah. And people forget, baseball's changed so much now. I was talking about my mom the other day, and she was there the night the Braves first came to Atlanta, and Tony Cloninger pitched 11 innings.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
It's ruined his career.
Starters don't pitch 5 innings anymore. I mean, it's like platoon baseball.
No,
But
back
in the
then,
era that
it was a
Phil
big
pitched,
deal.
he pitched complete games.
Yeah, if you threw a complete game back then, you were a good pitcher.
Yeah.
But now they don't even give you a chance.
No, it's really, really crazy. Well, when you left the Braves, is that when you went to Conan Wolf?
Yeah, when I left the Braves, I actually went to Coca-Cola. And, and what happened with me, I mean, and clearly when you're a kid, and I was still a kid, I was in my early 30s, your perspective on things is a little different than it might be later. But, Coca-Cola hired me. And back then, it wasn't that big a company. So I was in charge of the Olympics, and I was in charge of baseball, and I was in charge of, all these local promotions they had. So I had, an enjoyable job, but compared to working for Ted Turner and the Braves, it just seemed really boring. And so they would, in hindsight, they would send me out to be the company's representative at their Bottlers Association meetings. And I felt like I was a mascot. I didn't feel like I was doing anything. In fact, Ted called me one time and he said, Bob, he said, what's the big difference in working for me and working with Coca-Cola? And I said, well, the biggest difference is we'd have lunch and decide we were going to do something, and we go out and screw it up that afternoon. At Coke, we have meetings and meetings and go through weeks and weeks of preparation. Then we screw it up. It just was, a different environment for me, and one I wasn't used to. And I don't think until later, I appreciated the opportunity they had given me, because at Turner was an interesting time. We came up with the idea of CNN at dinner one night. There were 3 of us, and we just tossing it around. And so Ted said, okay, let's do news, and jumped in just like that. And one year, as you may recall, when Ted first bought the Hawks, even though I was still doing all my other stuff, I was doing the promotion at the TV station, I was doing the Braves. He told me I was in charge of the Hawks. And I said, well, Ted, I don't really know anything about basketball. And he said, that's great. We're going to lose every game, get the #1 draft pick. So he had me cut the payroll in half. And if you look at it, it was the 77-78 season. And we had the All-Star game, and he wanted to do that right. So we did it nicely. But we put together a team of cast-offs and rookies, and our payroll was $750,000 for the whole team.
That's unbelievable.
And but we jumped off to an 11-3 start, and he was furious because I disobeyed his orders. He called me in, and I said, Ted, I have no idea. I mean,
all these misfits, and they just win basketball games.
That's right. I was doing everything I could to lose, but we just can't lose. And we made the playoffs, and he was happy finally.
That's crazy. That's crazy. Well, when you went to Conan Wolf, I think it was the era that Norman and Bob sold to Burson, and that put you in the spotlight at Burson Marsteller. That was really interesting because you had a great run there. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was good. I mean, when I went to Conan Wolf, Bob Conan and you, I mean, together we were pretty good salesmen. So the company grew fairly quickly, and then Burson came in and bought the company, which was smart for Bob for sure, and it was good for me and others. And then they just moved me to New York, and at New York, I mean, I always thought it was amazing at the time because they were trying to figure out specialties of people. If you're at that top echelon, on the top floor at Burson, you have to have a specialty. Well, I had worked for Ted Turner, and I had Fred Smith, as you recall, at Federal Express was a client, had certainly worked with Hank Aaron, had Roberto Goizueta did stuff for him at Coca-Cola. So they decided my specialty was dealing with CEOs. At that time, it was the time of the high profile CEOs. So you'd have everybody from Warren Buffett to Jack Welch, these people coming in through the office. And once again, when you're young, you don't realize how privileged you are to be involved with people like that. It was just people coming into the office, and sure, they were known, but I don't think I appreciated the scope or scale of what was going on. And of course, Burson was involved in the Olympics and all the big things going on around the world. So, give me a chance to. I'd hardly ever been on an airplane except traveling with the Braves to cities in the U.S. and then some with Coca-Cola. But that gave me a chance to really travel all over the world.
Well, your late wife Susan, who was one of the finest, nicest, kindest human beings. Did she enjoy when y'all? I mean, here y'all end up in New York. How did she like that?
It was a love-hate relationship. And she loved to visit New York. People would come to see her. She was a great tour guide, but almost every single day she'd say, "Get me back home, get me back home." So
I was going to say, I kind of felt like that, because she was such a fine Southern lady.
Well, and also she was a big Georgia Bulldog fan and went to every, she didn't only go to every football game. She went to the basketball games, the baseball games, and she missed that. And when I went to New York, I was like a kid going to Disney World. I mean, I just, New York was the Big Apple, and if you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. I just wanted to see what it's like. But I think I was sort of shocked when I got up there and realized once you go to New York, they want you to stay. And so I was trying to look for, after 4 or 5 years, I realized, well, I'd had my adventure and Susan wanted to go back home. And I was thinking, well, I really would feel more comfortable in Atlanta, where I'm not going to say I'm a big fish, but at least I'm known in Atlanta more so than I was in New York. And so we were looking for an opportunity to come back. And then Mayor Dinkins, when the Gulf War broke out, they had a ticker tape parade. He asked me to be the chairman of the ticker tape parade. He really wanted Harold Burson to do it, but that's high honor in New York. You don't do anything, but it makes you look like you're a real New Yorker. So I thought, well, if I'm going to leave, and they're going to be sorry to see me leave, now's the time to get out. Otherwise, they're going to say good riddance. You couldn't cut it.
Left on a high note. And is this when you came back and started Hope Beckham with Paul?
Yeah, we came back and had a good Hope Beckham's been around for 30 years, so had a pretty good run.
And let me ask you this, because you did one of the coolest programs, the women's baseball team with the Colorado Silver Bullets, which I look at what's happened in women's sports. You were doing this decades ago. It's
interesting. ESPN did a little special about, I could say 4 years ago or something, on the Silver Bullets on International Women's Day. And I didn't think about it, but it was the first professional women's team in any sport. And so, and we, and Phil Necro and I sort of, the idea came from me. And it's because I had 2 daughters, and I just didn't understand why girls weren't given a chance or encouraged to play baseball. And, Hank Aaron used to talk about Tony Stone, who played in the old Negro leagues, who was a second baseman and a woman. And he would say, well, there are women out there who could play baseball if we just gave them a chance. And so sort of the seed was planted when I saw the opportunity, and it really came from meeting with Coors. Leo Kiley was the CEO at Coors at the time. And Leo said, I'd like for you to come up with an idea that's mainstream sports. And by that, I mean baseball, football, basketball, that can go out and visit all our 50 distributors around the country. And he said, I'd love for it to be something that would make my old, granddad Pap, who played for the Red Sox, roll over in his grave. And so I came back to him. And I thought, well, this is the chance. And I said, give me some seed money. I'll see if this can be done. And first thing I did is I thought, well, I got to have credibility. So I'm going to, whoever manages the team, the coach needs to be beyond reproach. And so I made my list and came up with 6 names. All of them were Phil Necro, because I thought, first of all, you got to have somebody that you can, who played in the big leagues, has credibility, coached in the minor leagues, big leagues, which Phil had done all of that, but also somebody that you can trust with 25 women on the road all summer and who would be serious about it. So I called Phil up one day, and I knew that Phil's catcher growing up was his sister Phyllis. And so I talked to him. I said, Phil, I'm going to ask you something today. I do not want an answer. Before you answer me, I want you to talk to Phyllis, and I want you, talk to Nancy, your wife. And so I told him what it was, and his first reaction was, I don't think so. And I said, Phil, I'm not. And so I called him back, I guess, maybe 2 weeks later. And I said, Phil, what's your answer? And he said, Bob, I'll do it, but I'll only do it if we do it right. He said, it's going to be baseball as baseball's played today. He said, if there's any sort of compromise relative to the women, having men as pitchers or whatever, it's going to be their decision. And he said, and I'm going to get a first-class coaching staff, and we're going to really treat it serious. And so I said, well, that's sort of the way we want to do it. So Phil, he put together a coaching staff that any big league team would be proud to have. We had, Joe Pignatano was our catching coach. We had, Johnny Grubb was a hitting coach who played 16 years in the big leagues. We had Al Bumbry, who was hired away to be the hitting coach of the Cleveland Indians midseason. We had, Joe Necro as a pitching coach, and went around the country. We had about 5,000 women try out. We didn't know we knew we were looking for good athletes. We didn't know exactly whether tennis players or whatever could adapt to baseball. We finally realized that you either have to have played a lot of baseball, or you had to be a really top softball player who, was free swinging, not a slap hitter. And then we found out, much to our surprise, that there was a core of really good women pitchers. And these women were the ones who, if you're 10 years old and you're playing in the Little League, they send the girls over to softball, unless it's your best pitcher. So we had these girls who were always the best pitcher all the way through high school. And some of them, I'll use the example, Pam Davis was a right-handed pitcher. She was 12-1 as a senior playing baseball in Tampa, Florida, and was the MVP in baseball despite being the only girl playing baseball. And then we had, Leanne Ketchum in Alabama was the all-star right-handed pitcher, the only girl who played baseball in Alabama in the high school. So we had, at least enough pitchers that pitching wasn't as big a problem as hitting. And the first year, we did it for 4 years. The first year they struggled to hit. Then they saw enough pitches, and we got, 2 or 3 really top players added in. And by the, 4th year, last year we did it, they were beating college men's teams, low minor league teams. Nobody wanted to lose to them. If we went in to play a Class A minor league team, you could pretty well be assured that somehow, magically, that day, there were 2 AAA pitchers added to that Class A team
to make sure that they didn't lose to them.
But they were very competitive. They did a great job, and Phil was just wonderful as a coach.
Well, Bob, let me ask you this. You've been in the business for a long time, and I one of the things that I try to fight is sounding like a fossil, like back then. But it seemed to me in that era, corporations would take bigger chances. I mean, Don Keogh, Herb Kelleher, Leo Cocky. I mean, these it seemed like it was more of a why not era than a why era. It's almost like today they look at so many analytics that a big idea doesn't get through anymore. Do you find that to be
Well,
the
I
case?
think we live in a world of safe choice when it comes to corporate America, but and it just and plus the money's so big. Back then you could. Um, I was trying to think, who was the famous CEO at Pepsi for a while. I can't think of his
Roger
name.
Enrico.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Roger Enrico. One time when I was meeting with him, said, Bob, he said, the ideal mix is you want to have 5 big things you're doing. He said, 2 of them have to work, 2 of them should work, and 1 should be a flyer. Just something that it's not going to hurt you, but if it goes, it's going to go big. And, that kind of mix was, I think, very common back then, but now
Yeah.
it's, do what's safe.
Yeah. Well, I want to pivot again. Today's topic is about giving back, and you, Bob, I'm gonna compliment you. You've always been a guy that even your promotional programs always had a charitable connection to it. There was always something there, and at Hope Beckham, I've watched over the years some of the things that you've done, and then I watch, you with your family and every time I turn around, you're at a gala that's raising money, and you're supporting this, and you're the chairman of this and chairman of that. But that's been a big part of you, and your DNA, and you should be very, very proud of that. I know I first met Coach Dooley when we did a project for him at Georgia at Conan Wolf. And then I got to be really, really good friends with him after he retired, and we were doing a bunch of stuff with retired football coaches, and then he was with the American Battlefield Trust. But one of the projects y'all did is an ongoing project that you go to Honduras. Talk about that project, how it started, and what you do down there, because I'm
Well,
really
the way
intrigued
it
by
started, I think all of us want to make our little dent in a positive way while we're here on Earth. It's just and give back a little bit. Well, 30 years ago, there was a big hurricane in Central America, Hurricane Mitch, and it was pretty devastating in Honduras. And I got a call asking if I could help um, get water and some other supplies that they could ship to a place in rural Honduras. And so I said, sure, I'll try. So I actually called Phil Marino at Pepsi, and I called also Coca-Cola, and asked if there was any way they could ship water to this area. And then I gave them a phone number of a retired general who was coordinating everything. And so my phone call to Phil Marino was as long as what I just explained. I just, can you do it? Here's a phone number if you can. And that was it. And then I get this call asking me, he said, well, we'd love for you to come down and see this area just to visit. So I went down there, and Susan, actually, my wife, had been to the area before with the church, but always told me I'd never, it was too remote for me. I wouldn't do well there. And then my daughter, Claire, went down and worked for a summer in Honduras. And she's the one who said, Dad, I think you would like it if you came down and saw it. So I thought, well, I'm curious, so I'll go. Well, I was staying at this ranch, and the ranch was pretty rustic. I thought, I'm not sure how much I like this or not. But then they took me out to a remote village. And we drove as far as we could in the truck. And then we had to stop, this road was terrible. Then we had to walk for like an hour up a mountain. And then we get to this little village, and I don't know how many people were there, maybe 50 or 60. And the mayor gathers everybody together and through the translator and all introduces everybody and said, this is Mr. Hope. Said he's the one who saved our lives. He got us the water. And I thought, oh my God, all I did was make a phone call. And then they were showing me all the needs in that area. And at that time, this was an area that the outside world had not touched. It was like if you were going back a century, you didn't see any vehicles, you didn't see anything, and they didn't have schools. So I said, what can I do? I don't really want to put a church group together and work in a village for a week and, build gardens or whatever. And I said, is there anything else? And they said, well, we don't have school down here. Is there any way you can put together some, just people who will come down and figure out how we can get a school? And so we started taking people down there, just asking friends, Coach Dooley being one of them, if they wanted to go. And took maybe the first year, maybe there were 10 or 12 of us. And then we figured out what we could do and all. And we came back and did a report. Here's what needs to be done. And after a couple of years, we realized nothing's going to happen unless we have money. So we started a foundation called Honduras Agalta Valley Education, the AVE Foundation, started raising money. And we focused, we do other things now because the school's pretty well established. But over 30 years, we built just a marvelous school. I mean, it's, you'd send your kids to it. I mean, it's just a really good school down there. The kids are bright. They're industrious. They have a wonderful music program, art program, and we have about 60 people who go every spring. And then, obviously the principal and all the people that run the school are, full-time employees down there. We raise the money through our foundation, and it's just, it's a real passion. But then we do other things. But like Coach Dooley, what I was going to say, he went every year, and it's interesting. The kids down there, they now are on the internet and they can look him up and all that. But American football is totally alien to them. But Coach Dooley, they know he's a legend. That was all they knew. And they had a legend who was coming down to visit them. And that was a big deal with these kids down there. So when we were doing the landscaping, I'd say about 10 years ago to the school. And at first I thought, why are we spending all this money on landscaping? And then you realize that there's no truancy down there. Kids don't have to go to school. And so you want the school to look magnificently good. I mean, just to be the showcase of the valley. And you can do a lot with landscaping. So as we were doing our plan, we were redoing the soccer field. And the kids, have the internet. So at that time, Georgia wasn't going to name, Sanders Stadium, Vince Dooley Field. And so there was a little controversy. So the kids down there decided they were going to name their soccer field Vince Dooley Field.
That is so cool.
And they get into it. And it became, we had surveyors out there making sure it was perfect. We, it laid out the field. We had French drain all the way around it. They planted hedges, so it'd be between the hedges. They built grandstands. There are no grandstands down there. Coca-Cola, I called in. They said, we don't do scoreboards anymore. But then Coke got into it, and they have the largest scoreboard you've ever seen to keep a soccer score 2-1. It's like a big, giant scoreboard, a beautiful, beautiful field. We're going to dedicate it. And just of all times, this has only happened once. The president of Honduras called and was coming to Atlanta, and he wanted to meet with the CEO of Coca-Cola, Ed Bastian, the head of Delta Airlines, Jimmy Carter at the time, and asked if I could help. And I said, sure, let me see what I can do. So I lined up these meetings. And at the breakfast we were having at Piedmont Driving Club, I was trying to get anybody I knew to come to breakfast. So Vince is there, and I introduced the president, and I said, President Hernandez, this is the most popular person in the state of Georgia. This is Vince Dooley. I said, he led the Georgia Bulldogs to the national championship. And by the way, we're going to dedicate Vince Dooley Field on March 18th in Honduras, and I want you to be there. And so he scrambles around, gets his assistant, and looks at the date and all writes it down. So we quickly announced at the ESPN that, the president of Honduras was going to dedicate Vince Dooley Field in Honduras. So they did a little blurb. And so about a month ahead of time, his office gives a call and said, well, the president can't make it. We're going to send some cabinet member. And I said, no, it's been on ESPN. You can't do that. So I sent them that little clip. So they called back, and the president is coming. And I don't know what I thought. It was absolutely crazy. I thought it was like the governor showing up. It's a small country. He had 60 military in their vehicles with him. He came in on one of 3 giant helicopters. We had the dedication of Vince Dooley Field, which is a big event. And Vince actually walked over at the end to Clark Dean, who was there, and said, Clark, this might be the greatest day of my life.
Wow.
Vince was very involved. In fact,
it's interesting. I've told our listeners I have a former business partner, a guy named Ron Cook, and he has this wonderful line. He says, "Remember, coincidence is when God chooses to be anonymous."
Oh, yeah.
And
And I think, and I do think there's a lot to be said for that. It happens just way too often.
right. I
Like,
mean, you look at the trail. You just called one guy to get some water, and you look what that water ultimately fertilized in terms of what y'all have done down there. And you know, I think at some point it'll be revealed to us lives we've touched that we don't even know those people, but because of what you did, somebody went to a school for the first time, grew up and did something significant for somebody else. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
well, I mean, and it makes you feel good. I tell the people when I recruit them, we now have generally just try to stick with 60 people because that's a good number. But I tell them, I said, you're going down there in your mind to help the people of Honduras. However, you're going to find that you're making a lot of new friends. It's going to help you every bit as much as it helps them. And then these kids in the school, I mean, it's been around long enough. They all go to college, and we have doctors and accountants and lawyers and, a lot of, somehow, just like in the U.S., we have a lot of computer technology, programmers and stuff like that. But these kids are smart kids. You realize in a hurry there's a big difference between intelligence and lack of access to knowledge. These are very smart kids who had never had access to knowledge.
Pretty amazing. Well, I want to close by telling a story that you probably don't even remember. But, here I am. I'd been a coach. Now I'm in the PR business, and I went with you to a presentation, and I don't even remember who you presented to, but I remember what you said. And I have quoted you around the world on this thing. In the presentation, you turned to the client and you said, "My analysis of this situation is you need me more than I need you, and I need you real bad." It was one of the great sales lines I ever heard in my life. It stuck in my head forever. You're a legend, pal. You are. But you've done it the right way. You've done it with kindness. You've done it with humility. You've done it with ideas. You've done it with connecting people. That's one of the things I think, if you look at Bob Hope's career, you have been a person that has connected others to projects because, there's a great line, even the Lone Ranger didn't travel alone. You got other people to believe in your vision. But I also say this, the speed of the ship's always been determined by the speed of the captain. And you've been a great captain throughout your career. You've done so much for so many people. And I'm proud to have you as a friend and as a mentor. And I just can't thank you enough for being with us today on Shaboom.
Well, thank you. And I think the feelings are certainly mutual. You're quite an amazing person. You've had a glorious career. So
it's been interesting. Let's put it this way. I promised Charlotte when we get married, I promised her two things. I promised her I would always love her, and I promised her she would never be bored. And Bob, she's begged me to take that one back. And I think Susan could have probably said the same thing about you.
I don't think there's any question. I told people there were some of the things I did that only, particularly with Ted Turner, where only Ted and I thought they were good ideas. And the only person we thought who might suspect it was a good idea was Susan, but we weren't sure with her.
That's good. All right, Bob, thanks for being with us. Talk soon.
Thank you a lot. Okay, great.